All right, so feel free to ask questions as you need to. I'm going to just kind of walk through this. How did the development? So, what we're going to be talking about specifically is the market revolution. So, how did the development of regional economies and Clay's American system lead to a national market economy? So, how did a bunch of little small economies lead to a large national economy? So, the first thing we want to look at this term antebellum. Okay, we tend to think antebellum, oh, that's the old South. Yeah, it is. But really, antebellum just means the period before war. So we're looking at in the United States really this period like 1800 to 1840. We'll sometimes see 1790 to 1830, but generally we're right before the Civil War. And we see that there are three distinct areas in our country. Uh, and really, what I should say is three distinct economic areas. So we have the Northeast here, and this Northeast is generally more manufacturing, shipping, transportation, uh, shipping. I think I already said that. Down south, we have agriculture, but it is more cash crops. It is more cotton, tobacco, indigo. It's crops you can't eat, although sugar is one of them. And then we have the crops, or we have the agricultural society in the Midwest, which is the West at this point, and this is where most of the country's food is grown, even at this time. It is today, it is at this time as well. So the North, South, and West each develop specialized regional economies. So we're going to kind of look at those. So, first of all, we want to look at the South. So, the South is one, what technology ultimately is going to change the South is we're going to see the cotton gin. And the cotton gin is a really, really easy uh, invention. I say easy in the sense that what it does is it takes the heavily laden cotton. They're called cotton bolls. So they're laden with a bunch of these seeds. It's really labor intensive to by hand pull these seeds out. That's in one of the videos, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But it gets ground in through this wheel that has these spikes and comes out somewhat clean. So this cotton gin, what it's going to do is it's going to allow cotton to be grown in much greater quantities farther away from the coastline. We'll talk more about that as we go as well. One other thing that we'll see is right the development of the plantation system, but then in particular, what we're going to see is, see, I wish this would minimize here, but nope. Okay, what we're going to see is here's slave population in 1820, and here is slave population in 1860. So are we going to be able to make a connection between the development of the cotton gin and the increase of cotton and the need for more slaves and thus an increase of population? And the answer is yes. The cotton gin opens up other areas that previously could not grow cotton. Now it's opening them up to the ability to grow more. So that's going to be important. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin 1893, but it was still really labor intensive. You could see what looks like the cotton gin here. They're dumping bales in, so you still need people to pick it, but then you need people to work these machines, and so that's why ultimately we're going to see this huge increase in the number of enslaved peoples. Cotton becomes the dominant cash crop of the Deep South. We're going to know it as King Cotton. And why is it King Cotton? It's King Cotton because it becomes the preeminent um, crop. So in the South, you could see almost exclusively, we see some of it maybe up in Virginia, a little bit in Kentucky, a little bit in Missouri, but not much. What we do see is that corn and wheat are grown in the Midwest or the West, and that like dairy and cattle tend to be in the Northeast. Sugar plantations down below. But what we see with cotton consumption, notice, I mean, beginning around 1830, all of a sudden, really 1820, we can see the consumption of cotton increases tremendously. And what's cotton used for? Again, this is in a couple of the videos. Clothing. I mean, for all intents and purposes, people do not want to wear wool. People do not want to wear scratchy clothing. Cotton provides the alternative. And so cotton picks up big time. And look, by 1820 through 1900, it increases 800% basically. I mean, that's incredible. If I were a bet man and put money down in 1820, I mean, I would be incredibly wealthy by the end of my lifetime. Um, so it's something important to keep in mind. We also see the value of cotton exports. So now we begin to see key terms like imports and exports. So the United States not only benefits by the jobs that it creates, even though we're talking slave, there's still a market associated around the slaves. But more than anything, the product now that's being grown in the South is look at the export. By 1820, 32% of American exports were cotton. By 1840, 50%. And by 1860, almost 60%. So it becomes incredibly the southern part of the United States becomes the center of the world's cotton production. Now, this will change during the Civil War because all of a sudden, conflict, nobody wants to trade with the South. So, areas like Egypt and India become kind of leading centers of cotton production during the Civil War. But 75% of the world's cotton was produced in the United States. That's incredible to think how important this industry was to the United States. So it wasn't that easy to like get rid of slavery because now slavery is embedded within this system. What else do we say? You know, King Cotton. Oh, cotton stimulated northern textile and shipping industries. So don't let it be said by the North, hey, we had nothing to do with it. Oh, hell yes, they did. The North did because it if if you built ships that moved peoples from Africa to the Americas, then you're a part of the slave industry. If if you are buying products that are developed or created by slaves, then you're a part of the slave industry. And so the North had no way that it could totally say that it was not a part of this, especially the fact that they took the raw cotton and made it into fabric. They took the raw cotton and shipped it overseas. They benefited big time. We've already said cotton already led to an increase in Western expansion. So not only do we see, so this represents, sorry, let me get off of this page. So this goes down. So one dot represents 200 slaves. So what we can begin to see, and this is going to be a question that's going to kind of not haunt you guys, but you'll see it quite a bit. Cotton actually kind of begins to force plantation owners to spread out a little bit. And so we see where there are strong concentrations of slaves in the 1800s or 1790s. By 1820, a lot of those slaves have been sold or loaned to new plantations farther west. Okay, so cotton helps to spread population. We can also see, like, for example, I apologize. I wish I could take this off here. But it says, so areas of cotton production are in yellow, slave distribution is in pink. So clearly we can see there's a correlation between cotton production and slave distribution. I mean, it's a very obvious point, but when we talk about needing evidence, evidence is we can see through maps that the slave population has slowly been migrating westward, forcibly migrating. Um, this area right here, right along kind of the coast of Virginia through South Carolina into Mississippi, is known as kind of the Black Belt. So when we look at why did Joe Biden win the election, and again, I'm not opening anything, but I have to say at this point, Joe Biden won. what we can see is that um, Democratic, the Democratic Party was able to uh, um, take advantage of the large African American populations that exist within these former slave states, and that's why Georgia went Democrat. You might go, well, how come South Carolina didn't? That's a good question. That would be something we probably have to look at. But again, we are looking at a map of 1860 and not today. What we'll find is there's a ton or many more African Americans living in and around Atlanta now. Atlanta is the largest African American run city in the world. Um, what else? Last thing I just want to, so this just kind of shows you the percentage of population of whites, slaves, and free blacks. Interesting. Free blacks are down in Louisiana. How come? Well, the reason is because remember New Orleans used to be a French port. So before the Louisiana Purchase, New Orleans was a French port, and there were quite a few free blacks. However, once the United States purchases, then the state of Louisiana slowly but surely makes it more and more difficult to be free and African American in Louisiana. But you can see states like Delaware, Virginia, Maryland had a fairly large population of free blacks. But what you notice is, and hopefully this is, notice South Carolina, there's more slaves than whites. In Mississippi, there are more slaves than whites. And so what we start to see here is these states will become kind of the leaders in keeping African Americans down. They are going to lead the country in establishing laws discriminating against African Americans. Why? Because there is a fear that the majority population will take over the minority. So as long as we have power, we being the whites, as long as whites have power, they're going to create laws that are going to benefit them and not the majority population. So that's really important to kind of pay attention to. Just a couple of images. We know that the plantation, right? Generally, there was a big house. Usually, if it was a good plantation that was successful, it's going to be close to a river that they can transport goods. We can see that it was basically an inclusive community that people weren't expected to have to go outside the plantation too much. But those are just some standard images from the time period. Um, we can see the distribution of slave labor. And again, we're using all these as means to support ourselves. But notice a majority of the slave population worked in cotton. They second most is domestic work, so those would be like the house slaves, and then the other three industries of like rice and sugar, tobacco, and mining kind of take up the rest, the other 30%. But cotton by far is a majority employer. And here's kind of another one. So again, a lot of these are just facts that most of the slave owners were small time slave owners, right? 76% of the people in the South didn't even own slaves. Actually, this is in all the United States. 76% of people did not own slaves. Anyone who was a slave owner tended to be a small scale slave owner. And it makes it not right at all. You own one person or you own 1,000, it's morally wrong. However, what we can see is that about 17% of the slave owners only owned between 1 and 9. About 6% owned between 10 and 99. And less than 1/10 of 1% owned more than 100 slaves. So extremely rare to see one person own a lot of slaves. Slave owners, as we can see, only made up 23% or 24% of the total population. Um, the brutality of slavery, this is a little uncomfortable. So feel free to go through this if you need to. But, whether it is a slave muzzle, whether it is an ID tag, whether it is leg irons, one of the things we don't see on here is branding was often a case where you would be branded on your cheek or you would be branded on your shoulder. There's actually some additional, here's branding right now. So some of these branding irons, they would tend to be like specific symbols of the owner. Um, and in fact, we can see, of course, the brutality of slavery. It makes me feel really uncomfortable to see something like this. I mean, just it's horrendous, the amount of punishment that this person has undergone. I have no comment whatsoever. The other thing that I don't have an image of here is, for runaway slaves, they often would put this harness on them that would prevent them from being able to lay their head down. I'll see if I can find a copy of it here before I let you go. But anyway, horrific. We know, but how do you keep slaves somewhat docile? Is you take away their humanity, and you take away their humanity by treating them as less than human. So let's look at the North. So when we talk about the North, we're really talking about the Northeast. I'll probably go through this a little bit more quickly. Uh, this is where we're going to see technology. Yeah, we saw the cotton gin down in the South, but this is where technology really starts stepping up. In particular, like the mill, getting power from the water, which ultimately is going to lead to like steam engine. So what's the impact? What as the impact? What is the impact on the North? And what we want to ask is, what is the impact of immigration? So we can see across the board. I don't know why I don't have that term in here. We can see across the board that most of the immigrants into the Americas are Europeans. Most of them are Northern and Western European, in particular Irish and English. Okay, but we do get like Canadians. We do have South Americans, which are Hispanic. We do have Asians, and there are some others. That does include African Americans. Where did they tend to settle? Cities. I mean, that's pretty obvious. Now, so here's where Eli Whitney's kind of invention. So he's an inventor, and what do inventors do? They invent things. Um, so not only does he make this cotton gin, but he also begins to develop and refine the idea of interchangeable parts. So you can see interchangeable parts up here. So this allows you now to, instead of one person making a whole gun from start to finish, that means fabricating the pins, that means fabricating the rifle or the muzzle or the the is the muzzle, rifle, tubing, whatever, the stock, the trigger, all of those things would have to be manufactured by one person. And so what Eli Whitney begins to do is to think about, how can I make more of my item more efficiently? And so this is where we start to see these interchangeable parts. So now somebody can manufacture just the hammer. Somebody can manufacture just the trigger. Somebody, there's the trigger right there. Somebody can manufacture just the butt of the gun. And so then as long as those pieces are manufactured under the same kind of circumstances, then they can be interchanged with any other piece of technology. And this helps to push the North. What sort of technology do we see? The sewing machine, the power loom, the spinning mule. All of this ultimately will be powered by water and or steam. So we see technology that begins to alleviate an individual's single burden of producing a good. We start to see what are affectionately known as factories, where groups of people are working on the creation of some sort of product. 1790s, Samuel Slater, you'll see his name quite a bit. He used British industrial design. So basically, he's an English guy who brings across um, the ideas of a cotton mill to the United States, and it changes. And he brings it to the Northeast first and foremost, and it ultimately begins to settle down into the South. Most of the South's cotton is sent to the North, but we can see that the South does have some cotton mills. Here's what a mill looks like. I'm not going to go through it too deep. In particular, I want you to pay attention. This is what's called the Lowell system. So these are kind of the early factories. and it's out of Lowell, Massachusetts. This becomes kind of the center of kind of early forms of manufacturing. They employed 13,000 workers. They made 2.25 million yards of cotton cloth a week. So highly effective. So Lowell, Massachusetts becomes kind of this center of American industry. Um, it happened to be located right next to a river, which really helped for transportation. It had a ready workforce that constantly people are moving into, like the Boston area, and they can immediately find work. The first workers, women, women were employed. So this is the first real time that we start to see this movement by women away from the home, away from like Republican motherhood, to now where women are able to earn their own living. Uh, Not just women, but kids as well. Northern factories, we know, produce textiles, which is like cloth, farm equipment, and other finished goods. We could see the growth of factories leads to this growth of cities. And we're really going to see kind of this line of cities that are going to kind of be produced along the Northeast through the Midwest, because each area is going to have one thing that it produces, right? The North produces machinery, the South produces the cotton. It's the West that produces the food that feeds all these people. And so we have to then begin to develop transportation methods that are going to be able to connect the three parts of this society. Um, Tons of Germans we know are coming across. We don't need to go into this, but in 1848, there's the big social revolution that goes on in Europe. So we get a ton of new immigrants. Um, they come in, they work low paying jobs. Um, and what we start to see are the first time that Americans don't want foreigners coming in. So this is called nativism. Um, and it's basically it's the native born Americans begin to we could certainly say disrespect, but the native born peoples begin to really discriminate against any new immigrant coming in. And the reason behind that is because those immigrants are going to take their jobs. American jobs need to go to American workers, not to foreigners. That has been a constant theme throughout most of American history, and it really starts to come about during this time. Goes a little bit more into nativism. I'm not going to worry too much about that right now. We will talk about it, but I do want to talk about the West. What does the West? And when we're talking about the West, we're talking about the Midwest, which includes Indiana. Um, so, what's the impact? Apparently, I did that twice. So, really, what we're seeing is population. So, residents, 1790 to 1800, we're seeing tons of people beginning to move westward, westward migration. This is the beginning of it. Population growth, tons of land opportunities. Of course, we know that the Native Americans are the ones who are the ultimate losers, because their traditions, their homeland are all getting ready to be taken from them. But we can see the population density begin to increase over time. 1790 to 1820, we start to see the early beginnings of this huge corridor. Today, if you were to look from at a satellite map from Boston to Washington D.C., that looks like basically one whole city. It's during this time that it really starts to take off. Notice we have the center of population. So this is the center of population in all of the United States. It's to the east of Baltimore. And within 30 years, the center of population, where the midpoint of the population in our country, is now farther out into Virginia. It looks to be a couple of 100 miles from Baltimore now. And then by 1860, the population center again moves all the way out to Ohio. So we're beginning to see more and more people moving westward. And why? Because of opportunity. A couple of new technologies. We see the mechanical reaper, which allows you to cut hay and like much quicker than it would be by hand. And then secondly, we get the steel plow, and notice who it's made by: John Deere. So the little green tractor that we still hold dear, maybe you grew up and you got to play on a little John Deere toy tractor. It's that same John Deere that created the first steel plow, which allowed them to get into the soil. New technology. So we begin to see kind of these harvesting machines. We begin to see steam power. We begin to see new tools. And so now new areas can be harvested and developed. The West becomes America's breadbasket. We're still known as we're really known as the world's breadbasket. Um, Commercial farms produce wheat, corn, livestock. I mean, this is what the West does. So it's foodstuffs, technology and factories, and then cash crops. I'm going to fast forward here. And I tell you what, I'm going to just stop here because the last part is over the banking system, and we'll save this for next time. But there is some pieces in there about transportation that you might want to look at. But at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of shut this down. We only have about 15 slides, and I've clearly lost most everybody. So I'm going to make sure that I shut this down now. So if you have any questions, I'm going to stay on here to the end of the period, but please feel free to work on your stuff and have a great Thanksgiving.